My name is Mary Lynn Bro, and I founded and chair the Caroline Werner Gannett Visionaries in Motion series. Welcome to our 7th speaker in the Gannett Projects series. With us tonight is social innovator David Bornstein, founder of Dowser.org, a media site reporting on social innovation. He's also author of several books, including The Price of Dream, The Story of the Grameen Bank, How to Change the World, which is published in 20 languages, and most recently, the co-authored Social Entrepreneurship, What Everyone Needs to Know. Among his many awards are the 2007 Human Security Award from University of California's Center for Unconventional Security Affairs, and the 2008 Leadership and Social Entrepreneurship Award from Duke's Fuqua Institute, or Fuqua School of Business. David's Fixes column in the New York Times has launched a national conversation about solution-focused stories and the power of new solutions journalism. Creative initiatives in such areas as supporting microfinance, alleviating homelessness, reducing poverty, redressing health care disparities, and protecting biodiversity. Now, in honor of March 8th, International Women's Day, for example, he focused in one column on CAMFED, the Campaign for Female Education in Zimbabwe, an organization that has developed strong alumni networks and the culture of listening so as to empower women in African villages. Or the social technologies of the organization called RARE, R-A-R-E, which offers master's degrees in communication for conservationists. Through its Pride campaigns, RARE has been able to protect ecosystems, such as changing fishing practices in the Philippines or protecting Siberian tigers in China. In one of his columns last year, David Bornstein wrote, "Reporters will always be needed to play the crucial watchdog roles in covering malfeasance, corruption, and betrayals of trust. But increasingly, there is a new problem that the press needs to address as well. Not so much people doing terrible things that are hidden from view. It's about people doing remarkable things that are hidden from view." So tonight, in a talk called Are We on the Verge of a New Enlightenment?, we look to David for case studies and for advice about how the citizen sector can build and support effective social action programs and organizations at all levels. After David's presentation, followed by questions and answers, thank you, David, please join us for a reception and book signing outside the auditorium. And remember our last speaker, MacArthur Award-winning sculptor Elizabeth Turk, who will be here on May 2nd. Please join me in a warm welcome for David Bornstein.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? That's a nice introduction. That was the best one. I came to journalism. It was sort of my second career. I grew up in Montreal, and my first career, I went to McGill University, and I studied computer science. I graduated in 1985, and my goal was really just to be a millionaire. Computers were big, and Windows had just been launched, and being a computer programmer seemed like a pretty smart thing to do. So I went into the computer business for about 4 years, and I loved it. I used to work till midnight, and I'd be at my desk at the office because I loved solving problems. I mean, I think a lot of you probably do Sudoku on airplanes and stuff like that. I think we are wired to solve problems. We enjoy it. My kid used to love whether it's playing Lego or something or other. We like to build things. It's just inherently satisfying. But I wanted to do something that I felt was more. The computer program that I got the most credit for at my company, which I spent 15 months on, was designing an automated sort of stock system for this company called Stop and Go Foods, which was a chain of convenience stores across the United States. And I remember delivering this to my manager, and he was very excited. The client loved it. It was an automated reordering system that could do forecasting of sales and all this. And I remember going home, after that and thinking, I hate convenience stores, It's like, and I've just made it easier for them to sell, 2-liter cartons of Coke, right? It was just, but you think about it, a lot of us do that, right? So it really kind of, I thought, you know what, I really need to be doing something that I really love, but also aligns with a sense of meaning. So I switched and I went into journalism and I started writing for newspapers in New York after doing a master's. I moved to New York. And after about 1.5 years of that, I realized that I wasn't doing very much reporting on problem solving either. I was covering a lot of murders. And it was actually probably the 7th or 8th murder that I covered, which was a grandmother in Brooklyn who was killed in a sort of a random shooting on the street. And her son witnessed it. He had been standing at the window when he saw it happen. And I got this story. The son actually confided into me everything that happened. I brought this story back to the newsroom. I reported it. My editor was very, very happy with the story. They said fantastic reporting, and it was given very good play, the sort of thing that every journalist wants. And then I just remember, what did I sort of inject into the minds of millions of New Yorkers today was this very grim picture. Not that it's unimportant. I think witnessing things like that is an important part of the journalist's role, but I've come to see that it's just a small piece of it. So after that happened, I said to myself, I really wanted to find either quit journalism, maybe just become a nonfiction writer, or find another way to practice it. And I was fortunate because around the same time I heard about the Grameen Bank of Bangladesh. It was literally a few days later. How many, put up your hands if you've heard of the Grameen Bank? Well, you're a pretty good audience. Okay. So I'd say it's about half and half. But the Grameen Bank, it might be the way I'm pronouncing it too. It means the village bank. It's this organization in Bangladesh that pioneered the idea of microfinance, which is the giving of small loans to primarily women in rural contexts in villages. So this idea was pioneered in 1976. It was very small in its early years, but it's grown. And now the Grameen Bank is lending money to, I don't know the most up-to-date statistics. I should have gone online before this talk. But it's about 9 million or 8 million villagers. The idea of microfinance has spread around the world. There's about 200 million families today in the world being served with these tiny loans which assist poor people for self-employment. It's not a perfect idea. It has its limitations. It has people who do it in a very unethical way, and it has people who do it in a wonderful way. But it is an idea that's affecting 1 billion lives, and it, for all intents and purposes, has really changed how poverty around the world is being alleviated. It's changed the terms of reference for international development. And the Grameen Bank won the Nobel Peace Prize for this idea 6 years ago. So I was sort of in New York City. I'd never heard of this idea, the Grameen Bank. A friend of mine just mentioned it to me in passing, and I decided to quit my job at New York Newsday and go to Bangladesh. And I just kind of saved up some money. I spent a couple of months preparing, and I went there, and I ended up spending a year there, over 2 years, with a translator, really just interviewing villagers in villages, trying to understand how this idea is working. How do you actually make a loan to a villager? How did this organization start? Is it really alleviating poverty? And I kind of remember the excitement I had had as a computer programmer. These were all how-to questions, which is what you like to do when you're a problem solver. It's like, oh, how do they get the loans out to all these thousands of villages and not get robbed? How does the money not get taken? How do you make a loan manageable for a village, a woman who may not be literate and can't write down her weekly installments? So how does she remember what she owes? And they had solved all these challenges in very, very creative ways. And I realized the system really was working. I interviewed a lot of people to see that having this institutional access to credit was extraordinarily valuable to the villagers. And I was able to see there were many people who said, we went from 1 meal a day to 2 meals a day to 3 meals a day. We now have a tin roof. My daughter is going to school as well as my son. My husband has a rickshaw which he can peddle in the market. We store lentils in the house because the roof doesn't let in the rain, so we're able to buy them when the price is low instead of when the price is high. There were many, many important changes. We don't get as much lung infections, so we're not sick as often. Really powerful changes that came. So I came back to New York City after doing this research, and I was intent on writing a book and a series of articles. And I started calling up all these editors that I knew, saying, would you like this article? And they were saying, well, if there was a scandal, you know, if they were doing something wrong with it, but it just sort of seems like one of these kind of nice stories, and, you know, maybe we can run it on Sunday, you know, at Thanksgiving or something like that. But it was really, and, you know, or people would say things like, you know, yeah, we did a story on something in India 6 months ago. So, you know, I mean, and I said, but this is Bangladesh. Well, that didn't make a difference either. So it's like, but there was this real sense that this wasn't really a story. And this is, you know, of course, it's a much bigger story in the world today because of the Nobel Peace Prize and just because of the magnitude of it. But it's the same essential story. It's a story of how a problem can be solved. I mean, if it was a cyclone that was killing 100,000 people instead of a bank that was serving millions of people, that would have been a very, very big story too. So, and I remember just thinking, you know, there's this quote from Walter Lippmann, a great journalist, that says, the way we imagine the world will determine what men do, what we do. That was the quote. It was in 1920, so he said what men do. And when you think about it, the way we imagine the world ultimately determines how we act. And we have these people out here we call journalists who mediate the world. They bring it back to you. They put it on your TV screen. They put it in your newspapers. And they select, you know, in a very, very systematic and rational way, what is newsworthy. And it's an important selection process. It's not just what will sell. That is true. There's a lot of sort of market bias. But the deeper bias is what I call the bias of the problem frame, which is to say that something is newsworthy if it's explaining or diagnosing a problem, not even if it's diagnosing a problem, if it's reporting a problem. But it's not really newsworthy if it's reporting on anything that you can really do about that problem. And that the journalist's role really is primarily to sort of be this watchdog role, to really sort of show society where it's going wrong. How many of you are parents? Okay, so I think that this kind of journalism is like really bad parenting, you know, which is to say that, you know, it's like my kid will get better if I criticize him at breakfast every morning, you know, if I show him where he's going wrong every morning. You just kind of know that this is not a theory of change that works. And actually, there's a lot of behavioral science today that really shows that if you want to have, you want to get behavior change, showing people information about what's wrong, what the deficiency is not a very powerful thing to do. Actually, it's far more powerful to show them three things. The first is bright spots and examples of what's possible. The second are how-tos, what they call channel factors, very specific ways to get to those bright spots. And the third is to deal with the emotional, the motivational component, to really paint a picture that's very aspirational. Why do you want to get there? Because when you get there, your life will be like this. And that's a really good thing, and you want to do that. And this is actually a very, very powerful way. You can get people to change their smoking habits, their health habits. You can get them to save more money. There's lots of behavioral science around this. So if you think about that, and you think about what journalism does, we hardly ever do this. We hardly ever present society with the idea of where society could be, of really what our potential is. Now, in these little glimpses of stories like the Grameen Bank, you get a sense of, wow, it is possible to alleviate poverty on a scale that most people would probably have thought was impossible. And in fact, if you go to many places in Bangladesh or throughout the developing world where people have access to microfinance and more importantly, savings products today, you see very, very remarkable changes happening. And a lot of the experts who report on this are very surprised that people can come so far in such a short amount of time. It's sort of, you know, the poor will always be with us, right? This is kind of the idea that we've been brought up with. But that may not be so. So after I wrote this book on the Grameen Bank, I realized, wow, you know, the guy who started the Grameen Bank, Muhammad Yunus, who shared the Nobel Peace Prize, was a really creative person. But I realized he wasn't just a problem solver. He had that sort of brew of skills that entrepreneurs have, you know, kind of like Steve Jobs. He was one of these people who could see over the horizon to something that other people weren't seeing, a new product, a new idea that everybody else said could never possibly work. he was able to get other people excited so that they would join him. That's one of the first things that you have to do when you have an idea, is you have to get other people to want to build it with you. So they have to be excited by it, because almost anyone has to take a leap of faith into your idea, because they're usually leaving a conventional sort of pathway and moving to an unconventional pathway. So you have to be able to persuade them that this is something that's aspirational, very exciting for them to do. And then the main thing is you have to be willing to sort of fail so often that you eventually succeed. Kind of like Thomas Edison's famous quote, "I didn't fail, I just found 5,000 ways it won't work." Okay? So, and every success works in that way. I mean, people just iterate and iterate and iterate and listen really well, and eventually they come up with a model, a blueprint that seems to work. So I saw this pattern with the Grameen Bank. Then I heard that there was this organization called Ashoka, which I wrote my second book about, that sort of goes around the world. They're kind of like a bloodhound, and they're or like talent scouts for people who are like this, who are these entrepreneurial individuals. But instead of really wanting to profit maximize, they want to social impact maximize. And so they end up building these wildflower institutions that other people wouldn't have thought to build, that find better ways of dealing with issues like, a better way of educating children who are sort of where the asphalt ends, or a health system that works in a village environment, or a better water delivery marketplace mechanism that reduces costs, or institutions or housing arrangements that are more inclusive for disabled people. I mean, these are all real stories that I wrote about. Hotlines for street children. I mean, very, very wonderful things all around the world. So I spent 5 years traveling around the world, and I interviewed 100 people. And I wrote a lot of their stories in this book. And what I saw, doing these interviews, I mean, it was an incredibly joyful experience. I mean, almost a wondrous experience to be able to travel around the world and see it through the lens of people who had very practical ideas for addressing problems and had shown that they could execute. And in many cases, we're helping thousands of people, if not many more people. And in some cases, we're changing the patterns in their countries, really changing the way the problems in their countries were being addressed at the state level or at the national level. So after doing that for 5 years, I kind of thought, I mean, and then I wrote a book about it. I sort of thought, I could have read the newspaper for 50 years. Probably all the newspapers for 50 years, and not seen the world through this frame, and not had a sense really of what's possible. And it totally changed my life. I mean, I'm a sort of naturally a shy person. To stand up in front of a group of people and talk would have been, many years ago, my worst fear. But I was able to see that after a while, there's people who just kind of, when they find something that's very true for themselves, and then they see examples of how it can be done, can move forward in ways that are very often surprising. So through this process of writing these books, I got this idea of changing the field of journalism. Might as well have a good goal, right? I didn't thought journalism was something I wanted to get out of. Now I think that I want to just change the whole field of journalism. Okay, so that'll take about 100 years, but I eat healthy, so. But so launched this organization called Dowser, which is a small media site to report on social innovations. Then with a friend, we started this column at the New York Times, and we got them excited in covering solutions. And it's turned out to be a pretty popular column. We get on the most emailed list quite often with our columns, and editors are sort of surprised because stories about homelessness and foster care and all that don't usually make that list. But stories about solutions to these things, people actually respond to. So I think that there's sort of this hidden idea out there, or this hidden market out there of people who are very hungry to be able to get information that helps them to build a better world. But I think what's often missing is this sense of what's possible. So as I've been doing these columns and research for the past 5 years, I have had this idea that we are kind of reaching this sort of enlightenment moment. And maybe it's a little over the top, an enlightenment moment, but I'm gonna use it. If you think of the Enlightenment as this sort of period in history when we went from a kind of magical thinking or wishful thinking to a kind of rational sense of causality in the way we do things, the scientific method. So in medicine, you might say you went from bloodletting and leaching and stuff like that to germ theory, and ultimately up to surgery, and then in the 20th century, antibiotics and stuff like that. And with vis-a-vis many social problems, we're seeing, and only in the past 10 years, this kind of movement from a kind of wishful thinking to a kind of rational, applied problem solving. We see it in after school. We see it in early childhood education. You see it in summer enrichment programs. You can see it in all sorts of healthcare programs. So I wanted to give a few examples to make it, really make it clear. And it'll take a really visible problem in the United States that I'm sure everyone has encountered, which is chronic homelessness. Right? Who here, put up your hand if you've ever walked by a homeless person sleeping on the street. Okay? If there's anyone with their hands down, you need to walk more. So it's there's about 700,000 people in the United States who are homeless at any one time on average, and about 120,000 of that number are chronically homeless. Actually, that's an old number because I'm not including the number I'm going to tell you, which means basically they've been living on the street. That figure typically means people who've been living on the street consistently for a long time, which could be anywhere from 6 months up to the last 40 years. Chronically homeless people use an enormous amount of medical resources. There's a study that showed that the 10%, there's 48,000 homeless people in Los Angeles, which has the homeless capital of the United States, use about $500 million in resources every year. They're always using the emergency systems and all that. So it's a very, very expensive problem from the society point of view. But homeless people are also, it's now understood that they die at rates that are sort of similar to very poor countries in Africa, which is to say their life expectancy is in the 50s, sometimes less. So this is, it's been treated as a kind of a nuisance rather than a public health emergency, which is really what it is. Now, the reason why it hasn't been a public health emergency is because people don't really believe the problem can be solved. But that's a misnomer. They're actually, in the 90s, this organization called Pathways to Housing developed this model called Housing First, which actually proved very successful. And the basic idea was to flip the way we thought of homelessness, which is to say, it used to be that you had to qualify for housing. You had to show that you were drug-free, or you could obey the rules of the place that you were in, and then you could apply for, you could get into housing. And if you broke those rules, they kicked you out. Which is to say they were kicking out everybody who become chronically homeless, who don't fit that. If you can follow these rules and you can be sober, then chances are, or you can abide by things, chances are you don't fit that narrow band. Because about 50% of homeless people are mentally ill. A huge number of them are what they call trimorbid. They have drug dependencies, a medical illness, and a mental illness. So Housing First said the first thing you have to do is just get them into stable housing, permanent supportive housing. And then once they're there, you can stabilize their lives. And you can stabilize their health. Because if they're diabetic, there's no fridge out when you're homeless to keep your insulin. And you can't get a follow-up appointment if you have cancer or heart disease or anything like that. So you can't really stabilize your health or be taking your medication for a mental disability, for example. So get them into housing. And it turned out that this was actually very, very successful. So this organization called Common Ground in New York, who was run by a remarkable woman named Roseanne Haggerty, got this idea that they were going to try to do this. And it turned out that they were actually very, very successful. They were able to show that if you go out, and they did this in Times Square initially, and you beg people to come into housing, and you plead with them, you say, please come into housing, let us help you. They will eventually come into housing, and then you can stabilize their lives, and you can get retention rates of 85 or 90% in housing, which is actually quite good. So there's no more homeless people in Times Square, for example. Actually, there's one guy, his name is Heavy, and he just refuses to come. But they know who he is. Everybody knows his name. He's been written in the New York Times a number of times. Heavy doesn't want to be housed. But everyone else has kind of agreed to it. Okay, but that's how the problem has gotten. So now Common Ground, after doing this in New York and then helping another bunch of cities do it, they got this idea, why not put 100,000 people into permanent supportive housing and pretty much get rid of 80% of the chronic homeless problem? And we'll do it by July 2013. It's kind of like the equivalent of NASA's race to put a man on the moon. It's the social service equivalent of that. Okay? So they said, how are we going to do this? And they developed a methodology. They said, well, it's kind of like an IKEA bookshelf. This is step 1, this is step 2, this is step 3. and then go back to step one and do it again for the next person. And the way that it's done is just absolutely remarkable. So I'll just give you a few glimpses of it. The first thing you have to do is you have to know who the homeless people are. Because I'll explain the problem in a second. So they have to do what's called a vulnerability survey to create a vulnerability index. They go out and they get volunteers to go out 3 days in a row from 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. with a special methodology to try to name, photograph, and get some basic biographical information on as many homeless people as they can who sleep outside. And it's usually pretty easy to find out where people are sleeping. They get hundreds of people to volunteer. I mean, you would think it would be hard to get people to come up at 4 a.m. to do this. It's not. We're actually, this is not something you read in the papers, but we're a lot nicer than we look. People do this, and they do these surveys, and they do a really, really good job. Then they get all this information, and they rank people. Because the person who developed the vulnerability index used to be at West Point, and she said we have to figure out who our highest value targets are first, and then work down. And so the highest value target is, who's the highest value target? The person most likely to die soonest who's still living on the street. Okay, so somebody with end-stage renal failure who's been there for 20 years. And so they put him first, and then they work downwards. And then once they have that information, then they work with the housing agencies, with nonprofits, and they say, okay, let's house Richard. He's a veteran. 20% of homeless people are veterans. He's got all these issues. And by the way, he can't find housing because he has a dog. 5% of people are homeless because of their pets. Okay? So this is how specific it gets. Now only a third of the housing agencies in the country even have pots of money to house people who are homeless. But that doesn't matter because they all have pots of money to house people who are over the age of 60, which is a large percentage of people who are homeless. They all have money for veterans. A lot of them have money for people with AIDS or various disabilities. There's all these other pots of money that cities never used to be able to access because they had no idea who was really on the street. They didn't know who these people were. They didn't have their names and photographs and all that information. Now that they have it, they can say, okay, we've got to get this guy using this set of vouchers and this guy using this set of vouchers. And then the question now becomes, how do we speed up this process? Because if it takes 3 months to house this person, we now have them, they're excited, but in 3 months they'll be somewhere else. We'll lose them. So they've worked with a bunch of cities to try to figure out how to reduce what could be a 6 to 8 month housing process that requires 5 visits by a homeless individual to, in Washington, D.C., they were the best. They reduced it to 10 days and 1 visit. Right? And a woman named Laura Zeilinger, I believe, is the woman who did it, and she's a genius, and she should be one of the public policy people we write about a lot. And Washington, D.C., which had only housed 260 people in the previous 2 years before Laura did this, has housed 1,760 people in the 3 years since. So they've completely ramped up. This is a very, very significant change. So now cities all across the country, as of today, there's 118 communities that have joined this campaign. They have housed, as of today, 12,697 as of today. And a lot of these communities have just signed on. So whether they hit the 100,000 mark, 100,000 homes mark by July 2013, or whether it takes till July 2014 to do it, these cities are now going to deal with the issue of chronic homelessness in a systematic way. Now, the interesting thing is when I asked Roseanne, I said, how come this had never been done before? She said, there was no system to do it. We didn't have the numbers. We didn't have the evidence. We didn't know it worked. Now we know it works. We know where the people are, and we have an end-to-end system that connects the person on the street to all the various options in a realistic pathway. So now it's just a question of keeping the motivation going, finding the funding, and so forth like that. But in many cases, the funding exists because cities know that when they house these people, they end up saving money because of all the social services that are way more expensive. The courts, all of the stuff. If you get involved in the justice system or you go for emergency psychiatric care or something like that, it's the most expensive option for society. So there's no reason why this shouldn't be done. So what happens after the United States has the little billboard when you enter the country saying the United States, which has no chronically homeless people, thank you very much, we have a new problem, which is how do we prevent homelessness? How do we prevent people from having the social fabrics of their lives so rent that they actually become homeless in the first place? By the way, much better, still a big problem, no solution to that problem that's easy, but it's a better problem. It's not the problem that we have now. And in some ways, what we see in the field of social change is this. We move to better problems as we solve these lower level problems. Now, when I wrote this article that described this in the Times, it was the headline was a plan, I think it was a plan to end homelessness was the headline of the article. And the first paragraph said, this is a methodological plan to deal with a social problem and do away with it once and for all. The article actually ended up being, I think, the second most popular article in the New York Times for a couple of days. It was very, very popular. And I got all these emails from people saying, wow, wow. And what's interesting is that people really wanted to know, how can we deal with this problem? And I began thinking that the sort of the theory of change is, if we remember the behavioral stuff I talked about, is once you inform people about what's wrong, if you give them those bright spots, remember the bright spots, the how-tos, the aspirational stuff, if you present that stuff, you actually create a lot of motivation to solve problems. People want to join these organizations. And I remember, I thought that's actually what journalism has to do. We have to tell the other half of the story. We continue pointing out what's wrong, but also provide a lot of solutions to people, not in this good news, feel-good, Thanksgiving hero kind of stuff, but in a really how-to, interesting story that's compelling based on the quality of the problem solving. And so this is what I've been talking about a lot. And there's many, many more examples. I mean, we've done about 130 of these columns. And there's so many problems that are being solved really, really intelligently. And the Enlightenment has sort of three pieces to it. So the first one is what I just said, is systematic sort of evidence-based ways of doing things. Okay, kind of like cause and effect. Okay, that's one of the key things. The second one, big piece of the Enlightenment that we're having now, is we're seeing that society has kind of like been so fragmented into these kind of silos, these narrow bands of thinking, what Adam Smith called pin factories, where everybody just focuses on one specialty. You see this? Has anyone noticed this in academia, by the way? Does this exist? Okay, so it doesn't exist. So, and what's really interesting, and in some ways, you know, if you read the first, you know, right at the beginning of The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith said the reason we are the greatest contributor to the productive powers of society is the division of labor. And that's really true. We really have to, you know, people do have to be specialists today. But when it comes to social problems, the division of labor is a disaster. It's an absolute disaster. If you have a kid from the inner city who has asthma, the division of labor is an absolute nightmare. You know, and for the simple reason that most asthma problems are related to housing. And most triggers are environmental. So if the kid's going to the emergency room, it doesn't matter that he's getting Ventolin and all of these, you know, drugs that are fantastic for, I have asthma, and the drugs are amazing. You can live a totally normal life most of the time. But if you have the triggers all the time, which are cockroaches, bad housing, windows that don't close, if your parents don't know about smoking or dietary things like that, you'll just be in and out of the emergency room. And that's kind of how we deal with a lot of chronic problems. So this one organization that I love because it was started just by a student, a group of students from Boston. The woman who started it, her name is Rebecca Oney, and she actually won a MacArthur Genius Grant, and she really deserved it. She went into inner city hospitals in Boston, and she actually had worked in legal services before that. She thought she wanted to be a lawyer, and she found that people would come in to try to come in for pro bono assistance for their housing problems because they were fighting with their landlords, but they would often come in with their kids, and the kids were always sick. And she began to put two and two together and realize that the kids were always sick because of the conditions that they were in. So she went to this hospital. She heard about this man named Barry Zuckerman, who headed the pediatric ward at that time it was Boston General. I think it was Boston General. And she had read that the first thing he did when he became head of the ward was to hire a lawyer to defend the legal rights of the patients who came in because he had noticed the same problem. So she thought, what a great idea. So she and a bunch of students went there, and she spoke to him. She said, I think students could really help your patients. And so through that process, this organization called Health Leads got started. And what they do, they actually work in 21 health centers now, they train 1,000 volunteers each year, student volunteers each year. And what they do is they man what they call family help desks that are located in pediatric wards, in hospitals that are in high poverty areas, or in federal health centers that are in high poverty area. And what they do is they ask the doctors to tell them what the social needs are that are associated with the patients that they see. They actually give doctors a prescription form. So the doctors have their normal prescription form for the medicine, and then they have a social prescription where they can tick off improved housing, nutrition, vocational training, various things that the kid may need to deal with, nutrition, improved nutrition and so forth. Because what happens is doctors who are so stressed out in these hospitals don't often ask about social conditions for patients, because if they hear that there's a problem, I'm in an unsafe relationship, for example, they really only have 13 minutes to spend with this person. They can't take 20 bucks out of their wallet every time and say, go to the grocery store. The social workers in these large inner city hospitals often have 25,000 patient visits for each social worker. So they only can focus on abuse and neglect. They don't have time for nutrition and stuff like that. Are you in a heat or eat situation like many families in Boston are in? So, but Rebecca thought that the students would be really good at solving this problem, because what are students good for? What are students wired to do? Google searches, right? Finding stuff, right? That's what kids do. So what is the problem of a person who comes into a hospital? There's all these services that are available, but the mother who's coming in and is in a crisis situation because she has a sick daughter may not know of all the services that are available. Nutrition services, vocational services, English language services, swimming programs, a fresh air fund kind of program to get the kid out of the city, vouchers you can get for housing, all the stuff that is available. And they put together these resource directories, and these students work on helping to fill the social prescriptions. Now this has become so successful in these hospitals that it's now in some places it's part of the electronic medical record, so that it actually goes into the patient's files that they've gotten these services. So it's like part of their health care, that they got help with their housing. So you see, we're beginning to put the pin factory together. We're beginning to get a kind of a one-stop shop, a supermarket where you can get all of these things together. And what they find is that in most cases, the students can get a service. In about 60% of the cases, they get a vital service within about 3 months' time. Now, what's really, really interesting is that 2/3 of the students, wait, what's the percentage? I always forget the exact statistics, so I write them down. Sorry, 1 second. 2/3 of the students who are volunteers for health leads want to go into careers as doctors or as healthcare professionals. And what's really interesting is when you interview them and you say, what kind of healthcare professional will you be? What kind of doctor will you be? They say things like, well, I'm never going to give someone a prescription that says take with food without also saying, do you have food for the full month? I'll never make that mistake, which is made all the time now in our health system. I'm never going to actually separate the social determinants of health from health care, right? Because health care isn't really health care. Health care, as we describe it, is really disease elimination, right? It's actually people go in with bad things happening, and we try to get them back to neutral. That's the best that we do. Whereas health care is really trying to figure out what causes illness, and how do you pull those things out? How do you get rid of the social determinants that cause a lot of ill health? And if you speak to social workers in the inner city, a lot of them will tell you the best thing you could do for the health of most of my clients I work with is to improve their housing. It would be more important to them than access to doctors, or equally important. I wouldn't say more important. So now you have an example, and this is now spread to 21 centers. But what's interesting is that it's also getting attention from the government. Like, for example, Michelle Obama is a really big fan of health leads, and she actually invited Rebecca to a celebration at the White House and all that to talk about it. So you now have this model that is now being talked about as what American healthcare has to evolve into, this integrated model. So that's another key example. And the third big piece in this Enlightenment moment, so the first one was that sort of systematic, evidence-based problem solving. The second one is integrating, pulling things together that historically were dealt with in a non-rational separateness. And the third one is this realization that human beings are not widgets, that we are very irrational. We act through our hearts more than our heads, or just as much. And there's so many things that we're trying to do now that treat people as if they're sort of like vessels where you can just kind of pour knowledge into them. Okay, like for example in education. So one of the really, really cool programs that we wrote about, I'm going to actually talk about two, if I have enough time. Let me just check my time. Is, okay, so how many of you know that a lot of schools have just kind of eliminated or cut back on recess? You know that? Okay. So put up your hands if you really liked recess when you went to school. Okay? Okay. So how many have read the book Hard Times by Charles Dickens? You remember Thomas Gradgrind, right? Play, fun, fancy, none of that stuff is very good. That was what they thought, or utilitarians thought in England 150 years ago, and what a lot of educators in the United States may not think but are acting on today, that idea. Because they've really, in schools across the United States, they've pulled back on recess, on music, on the arts, and all this stuff, and there's a lot of this teaching to the test. Now what's really interesting, if you look at this from the point of view of children's well-being, is that I have an 8-year-old son, if I ask him, how was school today? And I do this, I say, how was school today? He always tells me what he did at recess. It's the first thing. You know, I played with Ash, I got 2 goals. I mean, whatever, it's always a recess or lunchtime play experience. It's right at the forefront. His emotional experience in school, whether he likes school, whether he feels happy to go, is really based on his playtime experience at school. It's not based on, hopefully he's learning something. I think he might be, he never talks about it. But this is so important. Now Plato knew this. Plato said that you can't become a virtuous citizen unless you learn how to play. There's many, social psychologists say that the way children learn how to negotiate the social environment, the transactions that happen with other people, all of those so important social skills that are part of citizenship and just part of enjoying life come through these experiences. So how do we bring play back into the school? Well, one of the biggest problems, if you ask school principals in inner cities, what is the biggest nightmare you have? They all say recess. The kids fight. My nurse is in tears. Every day something happens. We have so many disciplinary infractions. And what's happened is that schools have responded in insane ways. Some schools have created zero-tolerance fighting policies, which is to say that they suspend 6-year-old kids, mostly African-American boys, by the way, for getting into fights. A lot of schools have banned tag. They just say you cannot play tag anymore. The kids don't know appropriate touch, right? And they've really done this, and then they've cut back on recess time. Now, if you think about this and you think all of this kind of, this is all premised on this idea that you could possibly teach to kids as if they're widgets, as if they don't need to play. Okay, so this organization that I have written about in the New York Times that's doing great work, they're going to be in 700 schools in a few years. What they do, they're called Playworks, and they send people into schools, into inner city schools, to teach the kids how to play. Now this might sound really weird and sort of paternalistic, but it's not. A lot of kids today, because they haven't had the outdoor playtime, free playtime experience that you had if you grew up prior to the 90s, they haven't actually learned the culture of play. And because the culture of play is a set of skills. It's not just anyone knows how to play. Knowing how to make up rules that are fair, knowing that it's important to abide by rules, knowing how to solve conflicts, how to pick fair teams, how to switch people around if the teams aren't fair, all of those are skills that I learned from my brother's friends who were 2 years older than me, and they all learned them from their brothers and sisters' friends who were 2 years older. It all gets passed down through the older kids to the younger kids, right? It's really a learned skill. And the adults, because they weren't doing it, didn't know it was happening. Except that if they remember their own childhood, they'll remember where they learned. I remember exactly who taught me how to pick teams. I grew up in Montreal playing hockey. You threw all your sticks into a pile, somebody closed their eyes and went one stick this way, one stick this way, one stick this way, and those were the teams. And if it wasn't fair, you played without a goalie, or you played without a goalie or something. But we didn't need any adults. But I learned that from Larry Tobin, who was 2 years older than me. He was my friend Maury's older brother. So Playworks sends people into schools to teach kids how to play. And what's interesting is, within a very, very short amount of time, instead of having 20 or 30% of the kids in the playground playing, because a lot of these kids, they don't like recess anymore because that's the time when they get bullied. And bullying is a really, really big problem now, because if kids don't know how to play well, what are they going to do? So because of the lack of play skills, you have more bullying, you have more intimidation. And bullying isn't always hitting kids. It may be hitting with boys. With girls, it's like, let's not play with Jane today. It's much meaner than just hitting somebody. But you have a lot of kids who really suffer. You bring these stuff into the school, they deputize the oldest kids, the grade 5s, they make them play coaches. They usually try to find the kids who are having behavioral problems, and they give them a purple t-shirt and a whistle, and the kid becomes very responsible very quickly. You give a 10-year-old a purple t-shirt and a whistle, they really like that, and they're in charge. And they teach the kids these really high-level skills, like rock, paper, scissors, you know? And I mean, you see kids, I mean, I've interviewed principals at inner city schools that see kids, and she's like rushing in there to stop the fight, and then the kids are like this, and they're like, you know, like this. And I remember with one teacher, and she was like, you could bring world peace with rock, paper, scissors. I have not seen so much change in the school since this happened. After 3 months, the schoolyard had been transformed. Then the kids are solving their own problems, they're not fighting. There's studies that now show that Playworks has. There's one that's embargoed. I can't report the exact the findings, but there's a real reduction in negative incidents on the playground. There's more. The kids transition back. Most of the behavioral problems in schools occur during transition moments, at the beginning and at the end of recess, when the kids are moving to and fro. Now they just want to go play, and they're not. They come back after recess. The teachers say they settle down much more quickly. They're more attentive. The bathrooms don't get vandalized at lunch because the kids are playing. I mean, when we think of all the things we do to people, we put them into prisons because they're not good actors. It just comes down to this really basic thing. If the kids don't know how to play, don't suspend them, don't punish them. Teach them how to play. That's the natural system. If the person has a human heart, they want to play. And so I'm seeing this in many, many examples where you see people have gone into these systems where you have a kind of dysfunction happening. The kids are not being kind to each other. You know, there's a wonderful movie that just came out. I say wonderful, but it's really hard to watch. It's called Bully, and I highly recommend it, about really how severe the bullying problem is in a lot of schools across the country. But there are wonderful programs that really know how to teach empathy now. There's one from Toronto, which would highly encourage you to look into, called Roots of Empathy, where they actually bring babies into classrooms. I wrote about it in the New York Times, and model a loving mother-baby relationship in front of the children. They do this throughout the school year with a really smart curriculum, and they've been able to show that this actually increases the children's kindness to each other. More kids are more willing to be friends with other kids. So there's been studies, randomized controlled studies, that actually show that this has a very powerful effect. And now neuroscientists are trying to figure out why. They think it might be because babies cause other people to secrete oxytocin in the brain. Nobody really knows exactly what it is. Sue Carter, I believe, who's one of the leading neuroscientists in the world studying this, is very interested in this idea of the baby as a biological, sort of biological trigger, making the kids feel good, getting deep learning at the same time. Who knows? It's really a big mystery, but it works. And actually, we know how to actually make children be kinder. And it lasts. It even lasts, beyond the class. They think it lasts at least 3 years, and it probably lasts a lot longer than that. So these are sort of 3 examples that from hundreds, and if you can kind of extrapolate from these 3 stories and just picture many, many more that you've never heard about, you can really kind of get this sense that we're at this very interesting moment around the world where literally millions of organizations are sprouting up because people can do it. People have access to so much more information. They have more people are educated around the world. More people are middle class. Around the world, more women can do things, have considerably more degrees of freedom than they had 30 years ago. And so you see these sort of solutions cropping up all around the world. And there's a really, really important role, I think, for journalism in writing about them. Very important role for academia in studying them, because a lot of it is a hidden history. Really important role for government in understanding what the policy implications of all of these changes are. But this is really just blowing up right now. I mean, I'm not blowing up, but this is really just exploding right now. And I also think that there's a real personal relevancy for everyone, in this room, whether you're sort of a journalist or an academic or a student. I wanted to put up this slide, just so. Can you see it? Did this slide working? No. Oh well. Can you fix the slide? I had a list of websites on it, which I wanted any of you who wanted to copy down, because there's quite a lot of networks around the world now that exist to help people find careers as social innovators, social problem solvers. Some of these networks focus on college age, some of them focus on the teenage years, some of them focus on career. There's one called the Purpose Prize for people who are social innovators over the age of 60. That's a really interesting one. So actually, that must have been on the next slide. The Purpose Prize, just purposeprize.org. That's you can read many, many stories of people who have started very creative problem-solving organizations in their 60s. The big thing that I've learned from this, and then I just want to stop and answer some questions, is that we can solve problems in a way that would be that's utterly startling. We don't even have a clue. We're all living in a bit of a Plato's cave with regard to how much potential we have to address social problems. Sometimes I cannot believe how much progress is possible. You see these oases of excellence, and there's no reason why they can't spread. There's this wonderful quote from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the author of The Little Prince, that goes, "A single event can awaken within us a stranger totally unknown to us. To live is to be slowly born." So thanks so much for coming, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Two quick points. We have a microphone on that side and one on this side with nimble runners. And we'll post that slide on our website under news, okay? So don't sit there and copy. Thank you.
So I'm going to turn it off then, because it'll shine. Well, actually, I'll leave it on for those who are copying. So don't be shy.
Is there a microphone on this side?
Oh, we'll start with the people who have the mics. Okay, great. Oh, okay.
He's a runner.
He's got to be a jumper.
I guess I have kind of a two-part question, two parts that are unrelated, two questions. One is, I've noticed that one of the things that I find that people are very resistant to these days, not probably people in this room, but when I talk to a lot of people on the outside, they're very averse to, if you say science, if you say statistics, they're like, that's all lies, we can't use that. And then they end up sticking with this mythology kind of model. And then the second question is a lot shorter. How do you know if you're Steve Jobs or a lunatic?
So the first part wasn't really a question. It was a question.
What can you do about it?
Yeah, the first part. Yeah, what can you do about it if you have a solution to that?
So, well, it's a really good question. I think what constitutes persuasive evidence is often different, for different people. Sometimes stories, sometimes direct experience is the main thing that people respond to, and sometimes there are people who need to see a research report that's randomized, and they won't believe even what's before their very eyes unless they can see that there was a trial done. And I think that you probably need to, you probably can find different ways of showing what's necessary to different people. What's often been interesting with, for example, Congress, a lot of the people who are trying to cause social change that I know, they have to persuade funders, policymakers, journalists all the time to write about them, to invest in them, and so forth. And you know, they will use whatever is necessary. They'll say, come do a visit, come to visit one of our schools, watch the way our teachers teach in our after-school program, just sit in the class. I think you'll find it very powerful. And sometimes they just want to say, hey, you know, we've done, you know, we now have graduated 10,000 people, and this is what they've gone on to do. So you know, there's that kind of Bertrand Russell idea that, I think it's Bertrand Russell, that, you know, the mark of an intelligent man is to be able to look at a column of statistics and weep or something like that. It may not be Bertrand Russell. I'm always confused things like that. But I also think direct experience is really, really important. So, you know, you can have, you know, both of them. You know, a lot of people that I've interviewed have felt like lunatics, you know, and almost everyone I know who's done something pretty creative has had long periods in their life when they really doubted, I don't know if they doubted their own idea, but they doubted whether they would ever be able to persuade other people. You know, when Muhammad Yunus started the Grameen Bank, people thought he was crazy. They really did. I mean, people literally fell off their chairs when he would say things and didn't believe him. In his case, he had to trust his own eyes because he didn't have data when he started. He just had these relationships with these villagers who he found very competent and thought that this could go somewhere. And I don't, by the way, Steve Jobs is an example that you use because everyone knows him. People are entrepreneurial at many different levels. I mean, not everybody's going to start a great organization, thank God. That would be terrible if everyone wanted to even start a small organization. There's MVPs. You know, for every entrepreneur, entrepreneurs are strange people in a sense. I mean, they tend to be very single-minded. They tend to be willing to have huge gaps in their lives in other areas, like in some cases not marrying and not having kids, and we're not spending enough time with their kids, and marriage is falling apart. When you are single-mindedly focused on an idea and building that idea, you often, you know, miss other things. So, so it's a very specific role. The person who brings together this team and kind of leads it and makes the meaning is a very specific role. But if you look at the entrepreneur as a kind of hub around that person, you need to have the people who are great at the human resources, really great communicators. Entrepreneurs are often terrible administrators and managers. It's very common to see them completely mess up their own organizations unless people come in there and help them sort things out. So it's not just the role for the entrepreneurs. It's the whole ecosystem that has to come together for change to happen. But the entrepreneur plays this kind of initial galvanizing, pulling people together role.
Just a quick question. Do you know if Rochester is on that list of
116
cities that are dealing with homelessness? And if not, who should the appropriate people, probably who are in this room, contact?
You know, I looked at the map today, and I didn't notice if Rochester's on it, but I'll tell you exactly where to go. 100khomes.org. 100,000, and they have a map that you click off right from the first page. You'll see them. You'll click to the map, and you can just see it.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry. I was just wondering if you're familiar with a publication called Yes! magazine.
I know it. Yeah.
Yeah, they're wonderful
Fran
too.
Corton,
and
David
Fran Corton
yeah.
and David Corton.
Yeah.
Fantastic organization and wonderful magazine.
Yeah, and they've been doing it for a long time. Thank you.
Add to your list.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you for the reminder.
I was going to put this one down because I talk with my hands so much, so I can't do two.
Okay.
Did I hear you correctly? You said that one of the things you believe that is missing is a sense of what is possible?
Yes.
Okay. I'd love to hear you comment more on that in relation to the aspect of intuition. I coach people on how to listen to their heart. I coach people on how to listen to their intuition because it's something that we're not taught in this society. And in fact, a lot of us were told how to turn the volume down.
Yeah.
And one of the key things that I see in social entrepreneurs or in what I listen to is that these are people who did follow their heart and probably did not get too caught up in the how, at least in some part. They had to turn the how over to something higher, if you'd like to say that. Because the intuition piece, their gut, their heart, divine inspiration had to take over at some point. I mean, I look at the same way that with like George Soros and Donald Trump and Oprah Winfrey. I mean, these people follow their intuition when you really get down to it. They've admitted to that. So what have you seen in relation to that, or how would you just address that overall connection if you even see one?
Yeah, no, I think it's very true. As a matter of fact, I was just at this conference in Oxford called the Skoll World Forum, which one of the co-founders of eBay, Jeffrey Skoll, has created a foundation, the Skoll Foundation, which supports social entrepreneurship. And they have this big forum every year where they bring together a lot of social entrepreneurs and funders and all that. And I was asked to participate in a conversation on faith and your calling, which was sort of interesting for me because I don't often talk about my faith. But I have actually been meditating for the last, for about 2 years now, 2 years and a bit. And it's had a big change in my life in terms of doing what you just say, hearing that sort of that quiet voice inside you. What was interesting is that in this room, there were about 25 people. I was surprised. Everybody who spoke also meditates. It's sort of like, really? You do? They all do it. And every single person in that room talked about the connection that they have to some sort of deep well of knowingness or of connecting to true things. I think it's a profoundly important point because it's the persistence of looking and the persistence of doing that ultimately leads to the creative breakthroughs. There's not the eureka moments. And that's in some ways the idea of genius as it's been given to us, is this kind of like these people just kind of get these flashes of brilliance, and that's kind of how it happens. What I've found in my experience is that people continue to look. There's this extraordinary level of motivation that leads to creativity. You almost can't separate deep motivation from creativity. It's the wanting it badly enough that you are willing to turn over the 100th stone and see if that will work. And that directly relates to their sense of belief. So I think that the sense of belief feeds right into it. Yeah, it's a very powerful source. Just throw it.
On the Skoll Foundation website, they are publicizing a conference, an international conference that they're having. And the topic that they are talking about at that conference is the ability to bridge business and social groups to come together to make social change. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's one of the most interesting areas. I talked about the integration of sort of health and housing and social services. One of the big integrating things that's happening now is, blurring the line between what is a social change and what is a business. It makes total sense, right? I mean, a business is just a structure to create value, right? You can create social value. The only difference is that a business is able to figure out a revenue model where people are able to pay for it. And usually with social change, if you can't figure out a revenue model, the government or someone else, a third party, will pay for it. So since so many entrepreneurs have recognized that the exact set of skills that allows me to be successful building a business can allow me to build something that's different than a business that solves a social problem. You've had so many people crossing over from the business sector to the social sector because they now see another pathway. And entrepreneurs are, it's a real misnomer. There's been a lot of research on this. David McClellan was probably the most prominent in the 50s who wrote The Achieving Society, that entrepreneurs are not primarily motivated by money. It's a really big misinterpretation. Entrepreneurs, all the research, the social science, the psychological research has shown that they're motivated by a desire to see their vision manifest in the world. Entrepreneurs are like kids with Lego. They want to see the thing that they can build, the way they imagine it in their head, they want to see it happen out there. Now, we're all deeply motivated by ethical concerns. I mean, nobody would have more than one child or two children if you only cared about money. It's a really bad monetary thing to have a kid that you have to send to college, right? You know? So, but why do people have families? Why do they do all these crazy things that cause them to spend money? Because we're not really maximizing profit. We're not wired to do that. We may want to maximize status unless we're mindful, and we realize that maximizing status actually doesn't make you feel very happy in the end. But so you have a lot of people going from one sector to the other. A lot of people in the social sector say to themselves, hey, you know, what if I create a business to do this? Is it better than my having to sort of get grants every year? Well, it turns out that for a lot of things, it actually makes a lot of sense to try to structure it as a business. I mean, for example, if you want to distribute water in villages across India, actually water is a bit murky. I'm going to put that aside. If you want to distribute solar energy to all sorts of villages in India, I wrote an article about this in the New York Times. The business models really make a lot of sense because people are already spending so much money on kerosene, which is a very, very unhealthy type of energy because you breathe in all the smoke and all that. It's not clean. It's very dangerous. There's lots of fires. If you say to people, I will give you solar energy for less than the kerosene costs you. And by the way, you'll get cleaner light and you won't have to breathe in all this smoke, but it costs, 50 rupees. Or pay me 1 rupee a day for the month or whatever like that. People will go for that. And by the way, you can work in an internal rate of return so that you can get money from investment instead of having to go to a foundation and get it. And then as the business grows, you can get more money because there's far more investment capital than there is donation capital. So it really makes sense for some things to create businesses. And what you see, the Harvard Social Enterprise Conference, which is all about sponsored by the business school at Harvard and the Kennedy School, the government school, is the biggest conference at Harvard, I believe. It attracts 1,400 students. It's at Fire Code every year. There's so many students that really want to especially get into these sort of social enterprises. That's why you'll notice that there's a number of networks here that deal with social enterprise. This Net Impact, this network of socially minded MBIs, they have thousands of members. It's a very, very interesting new gray area. And there's new corporate models, by the way. There's the B Corporation, which a number of states, that's called a for-benefit corporation. There's something called the L3C. These are approved by several states. A limited liability, low profit corporation, which is involved in social concerns. This is just happening right now.
Hi. I love hearing about all the bright spots and all the great stories, but you're making a case for this renaissance, this enlightenment. And I'm living in this culture where there's so much anti-government, especially in a campaign year, et cetera, that it's hard to see this enlightenment happening in this culture right now. And I wonder if you can comment on the anti-government and maybe your previous response about how doing it yourself with business models is part of the answer.
Well, no, you're right. It's very hard to see. These stories are in abundance, but they don't get told. So we don't have a communications infrastructure that's keeping up with it. It's kind of like the internet exploded and we still haven't started writing about the dot-coms. I mean, it's literally like that. Imagine that. I hadn't heard that there's these new kind of companies that are doing stuff online. The .org explosion is much bigger than the .com explosion. It's true. Around the world, you have this extraordinary explosion of organizations to solve social problems, and it gets a fraction of that. So that's an information ecosystem problem. There's a lot of ways that people are trying to deal with it, whether it's solutions journalism, the kind of stuff I do, or people who have created lots of online sites to try to transmit this knowledge back and forth. Vis-a-vis the negative assessment of government, there's sort of two things that are behind that, I think. Well, there's probably a bunch of them, but I can focus on. One is the journalist's stance to the government is set up so that governments hide from the journalists and try to sort of make everything appear better than it really is, because they have this sense that, because the journalists have a role that my job is to critique society, not to just report on things I see, but to critique especially the government. So that leads the governments very often to present information, or for the journalists to present the government in a way that is not very flattering. You'll never see an article in the paper that says, the mayor did a great job this year on this particular issue. You know, that's not considered a journalist story. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing that's problematic is that the role for the government in all of this social change is going to be very, very different than it has been. Because if you have all these social innovators that are cropping up around the world, what are governments going to do with them? Should they try, are they going to say, oh, that's a great policy idea, roots of empathy, bring babies into classrooms, we're going to put that in, we're going to enter that idea into the Department of Education and roll it out? It would be a disaster. It would never work. So what's the role for the government? Well, the role for the government is probably to invest in that program, to be like basically like a banker, a venture capitalist, and then a mezzanine funder, and then a banker. That's what would grow a business. But that means that governments essentially have to invest in things without being right on top of them and controlling them and holding the purse strings as tightly as they have, which is a very, very difficult thing for governments to do. However, there are a number of governments that have gotten into this. You know, Obama created a social innovation fund, which is doing just that. It's investing money in social innovators in a kind of hands-off way, saying, you have the ideas, we have the public policy interest, but we think you can execute on this public policy interest better than we can, so we're essentially deputizing you to go do that. And our job will be to fund you and to oversee you. It's a really good model. I think it could grow a lot more, but it's very difficult for policymakers to do that. Primarily because their biggest fear is not ineffectiveness. Their biggest fear is being caught in a scandal and being humiliated by the opposition. So that's a systemic problem, and I do not have the answer for that.
Okay, so you're aware of a problem. You're passionate about a particular issue.
Okay.
You have some ideas about that issue. Typically, it feels to me like it takes some funding to get started.
Yeah.
If you just have the very small seeds of an idea, where do you go to get that funding to start to work on something like that?
Okay. The first thing that you do is you map out your assets, basically. And your assets are not your personal assets, although they could be. A lot of people do spend their own money on their ideas, that's for sure. The idea is to sort of work with a bunch of people who, work with other people, bring other people together. And then, if you can get a group of people who want to help you build this idea, you sit there and you say, all right, let's write down every potential asset that we have. So every relationship we have, anyone we know who, if you're dealing specifically with financial resources, anyone we know who's in a foundation, who's a philanthropist, who's in this department or that department. You just make a long list of that. Anyone we know who might be in the business of giving people free office space or donating free office supply. I mean, you literally can go and you brainstorm out with other people all of your relationships, all of the potential places you can go. And if you have 5 people doing this on a piece of paper, you get hundreds of potential leads. Family and friends, second-gen relationships, people we know, so-and-so knows somebody at this foundation or knows somebody at this. Initially getting money from foundations is very hard. So individual funders, family foundations are often wonderful to deal with. If you can just have a conversation with somebody who's at that foundation and say, hey, I've got this great idea. You guys are in the business. You love dealing with this issue. Would you, it turns out that getting what you can think of as angel funding for a new idea, it's not really that hard. Growth funding is way harder. So the problem is not so much getting from 0 to 60 and having something up and running. The problem is actually when you have a great idea, going to the next level, getting from a good pilot to something that's operating at a larger scale. But you don't have that problem yet, so we don't have to talk about it. We have one in the front row and then one back there.
So let me ask you about the growth phase, because that's a terrifying phase.
Yeah.
You have 60, 70 people working for you who rely at you at some level or on the organization at some level for continuity and ongoing. What have you found has been successful? I mean, I know Skoll does some things in that phase of social entrepreneurship. Are there other things that organizations are doing? It's not like traditional venture capital where you get to a point and you cash out. You say, okay, I'm done. I'm going to. My business model was to find an investor to basically pay me to get out of my business. It's a different phenomenon. What's working out there that you've seen?
Yeah, well, there's many different ways of approaching it, and institutional sustainability is a very big challenge for all these entrepreneurs. What I find the pattern is that the really successful people are always expanding their relationships. I mean, they're always finding newer relationships, different ways of sort of putting it together. They're never sort of sitting back and saying, all right, we have these 50 relationships that we have. So that's one thing. They're always in the relationship generation camp, because I don't think you can avoid the fact, if you're a nonprofit and you have to fund through grants primarily, then you constantly either have to keep on going back to your same funders, you either have to get a whole new bunch of funders, or you have to reduce your costs, or you have to find out a way to make some money, which is not through grant funding, right? Revenues. A lot of them are looking for ways to get revenues. Like, for example, this organization Playworks that I mentioned, they raise a lot of their money from philanthropy, but they also get schools to pay $25,000 for each person they put into a school. Now, I interviewed a lot of principals about this, and I said, is it worth it for you to spend $25,000 to have this essentially play coach in school? And they say, yeah. Some of them said, I'll get rid of the computer room before I get rid of the play coach. I mean, they're really important to our school culture. But that actually works really well, because when they started asking schools to pay them $25,000, the schools started complaining a lot when they weren't getting good value. Like, we didn't get a good play coach this year, or Coach Joe missed a couple of classes, or something. So it turns out to be a really good feedback mechanism for the organization to have a revenue stream that forces them to be more accountable and higher performing. So it just turns out, if you're dealing with schools and so forth, that's a really interesting model. I'll give you one other example, which is kind of one of the big issues in the United States is this issue of food deserts, that there's a lot of inner cities areas around the country that literally don't have vegetables within a mile or two of people. And it's really hard to say to grocery stores, you should go into these areas, because they don't believe that there's a business model there. They don't think that they could sell enough. So what you now see is that, in fact, well, there may be a business model. They may actually be able to make money working in these areas. It may be a break-even business, or it might turn out to be like a minus 20% business, which is you don't break even, but you only lose 20% every year. But this actually turns out to be a really good opportunity. It's a really cheap way to get nutrition into these communities compared to a grant. Because you can think of a grant as a minus 100% business model, right? This is only minus 20%, way more leverage than a grant. And what you see is a lot of entrepreneurs are also dealing with, if you think of for-profit as plus 5% and better, and nonprofit as minus 100%, between minus 100 and plus 5, you have this big range. And you now have people who are saying, well, we don't have to be fully grant, and we can't be fully market, because these people can't pay market price because they're poor. But we could be minus 20. We could be more minus 30. And boy, we'll be able to grow a lot faster and leverage the grant money that we get in by a factor of 5 to 1 if we do it that way. So people are also using those kinds of market segmentation, market finance ideas, market segment ideas, and all that to sort of figure out how to make that happen. A lot of creativity in that whole sort of what they call impact investing. If you Google impact investing, you'll see that there's many organizations that are totally devoted to that subset.
So you talked a lot about the entrepreneur as creator, or entrepreneur as connector, and as wanting to see their vision manifest in the world. And I'm wondering, throughout your research, what sort of habits and trends and characteristics did you see most common amongst the constant innovators, such as the Skoll Foundation and all the other PayPal founders? they've gone on to do a lot of really interesting things.
What are the qualities? It's a good question. So what's interesting is that the typical qualities that you think of are not that important. They tend not to be super confident people, and they tend not to be super charismatic people. So this idea that the charismatic sort of visionary entrepreneur, you know, we read a lot about that, and the people who sometimes get on magazine covers fall into that profile. What you usually find is that their response to failure is very healthy, that they actually are always absorbing information, but they do it in a very healthy way. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was in India, this woman that I wrote about in my book, How to Change the World, wanted to start this hotline for street kids in Bombay. This was at a time when there were no hotlines in India at all. And so she went to 100 organizations and asked them to join this hotline. And 86 said no, and 14 said yes. And I remember she told me this when I was interviewing her, and I said, wow, you must have been so disheartened. That's a lot of no's. And she said, no, I was very excited. And I said, why? And she said, because I knew that for us to be successful, the people really have to be serious and really want to work with us. And if 86 said no, then these 14 must really be serious, right? And so, I mean, if you think about that, what is that all about? That's a kind of mental alchemy, right? Turning this lead of experience into gold. But what she was doing is there's a way of sort of seeing things that give you energy and a way of seeing things that reduce your energy. And this work takes a lot of energy. So one of it is being able to see things like that in a way. But you also have to see the real evidence. You can't just fool yourself all the time and trick yourself. So I do think that one of the things that is really important to success is that people truly derive a lot of joy from their work and pleasure. That they're operating from a really deep, honest intention, and that comes through the people that they work with. Because the number one quality to be a successful entrepreneur, the number one, I would say by far, is to be able to be a mass recruiter of other people who also want to align their energies and talents, you know, behind this idea. And you can only do that, you only have people who really want to join you if they feel that this is beautiful, and if they can feel that you love what you're doing and that they'll get to work with people who are, you know, it's truly meaningful and fulfilling to work with. That's what they offer. They don't offer the big bucks, but they offer something that you know is really important to people, and that's what it takes. You know, and you see this all the time. If you look at entrepreneurs and you see that they've surrounded themselves with really talented people, especially if when they were starting out they couldn't lure people with the money, they have these qualities. And I even think that what charisma is I've often thought about it this: if you take all the boulders out of a river that's a rapids, and the water can just flow freely without obstructions, that's charisma, which is to say that people aren't, you find people who aren't working at cross purposes with themselves, and somehow or other they kind of shine. But what they're just shining is that they're allowing they're allowing themselves to really flow in some way that other people gravitate to. Yeah. Which gets to the meditation and your inner voice thing. It's all integrated. How are we doing? One or two more.
Hello.
Where are you? Oh, sorry.
I have two questions.
Okay.
One is about humility, not feeling superior. And I want to give a personal example. I came here by bus, and I'm now stranded. So I feel very humble. I mean, I could walk home, I guess. But I live in the Park Avenue area. If someone could help me with a ride back, it'd be greatly appreciated. But to get to that point, to ask you was very humbling for me. I asked a number of people for rides throughout the day, and I was rejected by everyone, including my landlord. But all right. Now, the other question is concerning reaching out to people. I'm sure you've seen the easy button.
That was easy.
Can you hear that?
I can, yeah. That was easy. I heard it, yeah.
That was easy.
Okay.
Okay. It seems to me that maybe a good starting point is to try to convince people that the thrust of what you're doing really is easy, that an important portion of it is not incredibly complicated or expensive. But would you comment on that?
Well, I don't know if I agree with it. I mean, I don't think solving social problems is they call it problem solving because it is problem solving. It can be very, very hard. But I don't think people don't like hard work. I think people don't like meaningless drudgery. I think people really, I see this with my own son. When the problem is meaningful to him, he'll work very, very hard on it. He won't work on his homework that hard because he doesn't really see the meaning. And you find this all the time in these social undertakings, especially with these organizations like Youth Venture, which is over here, and Do Something. You find a lot of young kids who say, school's boring, they don't want to work that hard, and then they decide that through one of these programs they're going to create a video festival a youth video festival to raise money for people in Haiti. And they're up till 3 a.m. every night, killing themselves to put on the best video festival that their school's ever had, because it's really meaningful to them, and they're working very hard. So it's not easy, and I don't think you're helping people by telling them it's easy. You say it's really, really hard, and it's very, very challenging, and it will use your brain at the highest level, and you'll probably have to grow a lot in doing this. And then people lean into you, and they want to say, sign up, because I don't think people want it easy. Maybe some do.
I'm just saying maybe one step of it might be easy, and the rest then gets more complicated, but to draw people in. No?
I find that the challenge, like Health Leads, I'll give you an example. Health Leads, which is that organization of these young people who work at these family help desks in hospitals. When Rebecca started this program, she was walking across her campus and she saw these posters attracting volunteers. And it was always like, it's only one afternoon a week, 2 hours. And she kind of got, she was turned off. She said, we're asking people to volunteer to help poor people, and we're making it easy for them. She says, the rugby team, if you want to be on the rugby team, you got to be there at 6 a.m., and if you miss one practice, you're off the team. So we're saying that rugby is more important than poverty alleviation. So she set it up. She said, if you want to be in Health Leads, it's a minimum commitment. You have to attend every meeting, every training session. If you miss 2 or whatever number of things that you're supposed to attend, you're fired, basically, as a volunteer. And as a result, they got so many applications because they set it up as a challenge that they can only accept in some campuses 10% of the volunteers because so many people apply to it. Because she set it up as, we don't know if we want your volunteering unless you're really serious, So. There was a last question over there. Last question. Who had their hand up? Someone did, no? Last chance. Going once. Okay. Okay.
I'll speak loud and quick. First, I'm glad you're not writing software anymore. Second, what do you think has made, I like the idea of this new enlightenment. I see it myself in what I see happening in Rochester. But I'm curious what factors you think have happened that have made this start to happen now. What has changed? Or why are all of these organizations starting now?
I think there's a lot of powerful historical drivers, and I think we know what they are. The biggest one would be the whole 20th century, longer lifespans. People used to die in their 40s and 50s 100 years ago. And this is a global change. The second biggest one would be the women's revolution. All around the world, half of the world has way more capacity. A lot of the people that I've interviewed in my book, How to Change the World, were women who 30 years ago in Brazil wouldn't have started these organizations, or in India wouldn't have started these organizations. So you have a lot more human capacity. The same thing applies to African Americans, Afro-Brazilians, the Dalit in India, the untouchables, the Roma in Hungary. You see groups that historically were very disenfranchised, were in sort of incapacity, may not have had the confidence to do things that now can. A lot of social entrepreneurs in India are among the Dalit. You have more people, the number of people, I remember reading a statistic, the number of universities in the world in the 1970s doubled. just in the 1970s alone. Now it's grown way more than that since then. In terms of the number of people who have access not only high school education to a college education. And think of how many of your social relationships date back to your college education, and the things you've been able to do in life come from those social networks in addition to the education. The flow of money around the world, the number of people who are middle class in every society. They say that India has 200 million people who are middle class, something like that. And I haven't even mentioned the internet, right? I mean, and then you can look on the other side and say, what happened to authoritarian governments? I mean, if you go back to the 70s, Spain is still a dictatorship, right? I mean, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Latin America, a lot of African countries, very few degrees of freedom there. You go back 2 generations, India was a colony. Gandhi was put in jail, for his reform efforts. So there's been this real change in terms of what people can do politically, in terms of, so if you think of it as the supply and demand curve, the supply of people around the world who have all of these things necessary to be problem solvers has just gone way up. And the demand for their talents has also gone way up, because people now have more information, they're more apprised of problems, they recognize the really serious limitations of governments and the blind spots of business. And so there's this kind of historical opportunity where supply and demand have met around this. It's not a fad. It's part of the reorganization of the problem-solving work of the world. So, thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.
There's a little reception outside if you're worried.